What defines who you are? Is it your name? Is it your memories? Is it your voice? Imagine, for a moment, that all of this could be ripped away from you, not by a blow or an illness, but by a terror so profound that your own mind shattered into 10 different pieces. This is not fiction. This is the true, dark, and utterly bizarre story of Louis Vivet, the man who, in 1888, forced the medical world to question the very nature of human identity. In the 1880s, France was a melting pot of progress and poverty. For a young man like Louis Vivet, life was a succession of hard days, arduous work that barely paid for bread. He was described by some as a troubled young man, perhaps unstable, but who wouldn't be, given the circumstances of a life without prospects, spent under the scorching sun of the fields or in the dust of a dimly lit workshop? He was, in essence, a nobody, just another anonymous face in the working crowd of the French Third Republic. But fate, or perhaps a terrible flaw in his own psyche, was about to make him unforgettable. The day that sealed his fate began like any other, stifling and mundane. Louis was working, perhaps in a vineyard or a field, when the catalyzing event occurred. Historical accounts diverge on the exact details, but the essence is terrifying. A sudden and acute terror. The most persistent version speaks of a viper. A quick movement in the dry grass, a hiss, the sight of a reptile preparing to attack. For Louis, that instant was the apocalypse. A scream caught in his throat. The world spun. The terror was so absolute, so paralyzing, that his body obeyed. He wasn't bitten. He wasn't injured. But when the panic subsided, Louis Vivet tried to stand and couldn't. His legs wouldn't respond. From the waist down, he was dead to the world. The paralysis was instantaneous and total. The shock didn't just affect his mind. It severed the connection with his body. In an instant, the young laborer became a cripple, a burden, a medical mystery. The medicine of the time, still groping in the dark of neurology, had no answers. He was taken, like so many others whose bodies or minds failed inexplicably, to the cold and impersonal charity of an asylum. Records indicate internments in places like Bonneval or Rochefort. Life within those walls was a nightmare of monotony and despair. The smell of weak disinfectant mixed with the odor of unwashed bodies, the sound of footsteps echoing in stone corridors, the distant cries of other patients. Louis spent months, perhaps more than a year, in this state. He was a docile, apathetic patient, confined to a wheelchair or a hard bed. His paralysis was complete. Doctors poked him, applied weak electric shocks, tried hydrotherapy treatments. Nothing. He was a lost cause of hysteria, a vague diagnosis used for everything that was not understood. And then, one day, the impossible happened. It wasn't a gradual recovery. It was an explosion. Perhaps it was triggered by another fright, or by an EE2 experimental treatment, or perhaps by an internal convulsion. Louis Vivet, the paralyzed and apathetic man, suddenly writhed, screamed, and with shocking violence rose to his feet. He walked. The nurses and doctors who rushed to the scene were stunned, but the shock of the recovery was immediately replaced by an even greater horror. The man who rose was not Louis Vivet. His eyes were different, filled with a cold rage and a confusion that was not Louis's. His voice was deeper. When asked his name, he growled a different answer, or perhaps simply said he didn't know them. He was aggressive, violent, and most terrifying of all. He had absolutely no memory of Louis Vivet, of the paralysis, of the asylum, or even of the incident with the viper. It was as if another soul had invaded his body, and the first had been completely expelled. The doctors, accustomed to madness and delirium, had never seen anything like it. The paralysis had disappeared, but so had the man. The case of Louis Vivet immediately became the focus of intense observation. This was the golden age of French neurology, dominated by the imposing figure of Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Hypnosis was the tool of the moment, a key believed to unlock the deepest secrets of the hysterical mind. And it was with this key that Vivet's doctors, fascinated and terrified, began to work. They put Louis, or whoever he was at that moment, into a trance. What they discovered surpassed anything recorded in medical literature. Under hypnosis, they found not only the original Louis and the second violent man, they found a third and a fourth. Vivet's mind was an abandoned building with countless hidden tenants. Using hypnotic suggestions, the doctors discovered they could summon specific personalities, and they came. The number began to grow. Soon, they had identified and catalogued about 10 distinct selves, each residing in the same body. Each personality was a complete entity. They had their own names, their own perceived ages, their own radically different temperaments. There were docile and deeply religious personalities who spent their time praying. There were others who were childlike, frightened, seeming trapped in the moment of the viper's trauma. There were intellectual personalities who spoke arrogantly, and there were the violent ones who blasphemed, tried to attack the staff, and seemed to harbor a deep hatred for the world. Each had its own set of memories, completely isolated from the others. One didn't know what the other was doing. When one was in control, the other 9 were, essentially, dead to the world. To the doctors of 1888, this was not just a case, it was a dark miracle. The medical puzzle was a complete one. Doctors gathered in dimly lit rooms, Vivet's observation diaries open on the table, debating fervently. What on earth were they witnessing? The leading candidate was hysteria major, Charcot's favorite diagnosis, a condition believed to mimic almost any disease, from paralysis to blindness, all originating from a psychic disturbance. But Vivet's case took hysteria to an unprecedented extreme. Was it a bizarre form of epilepsy? Were the convulsions he sometimes suffered psychic manifestations of the disease, creating these fragmented states of consciousness? Another, more cynical possibility hung in the air. Malingering. Could Louis Vivet, the original man, be playing the role of his life? Was he such a brilliant actor that he could fool an entire team of experienced doctors, feigning not only paralysis, but 10 distinct personas, each with their own handwriting, tastes, and memories? This idea was considered, but it seemed implausible. The complexity was too great, and there were physical facts that didn't add up. The inconvenient truth was that, in 1888, there was absolutely no conceptual framework for what we now know as dissociative identity disorder. They were looking at a phenomenon so new and so shocking that they didn't even have the words to describe it. They were explorers on an unknown continent, without a map or compass, trying to understand a man who was, at the same time, a legion. What made Vivet's case so undeniably bizarre was not just the number of personalities, but their profoundly contrasting characteristics, and, above all, the way they interacted with his body. It was a spectacle of psychological horrors. There was, for example, a calm, almost sanctified personality who spent his days in silent prayer, accepting his fate in the asylum. There was another, perhaps the second to emerge, who was a well of rage and blasphemy, a being of pure violent instinct that needed to be contained. There were childlike personalities who cried and spoke in the thin voice of a child, seeming to perpetually relive the terror of childhood or the fright of the viper. But the most astonishing detail, the one that broke all the rules of medicine at the time, was the paralysis. The doctors observed, astonished, that Louis's leg paralysis was not constant. It was connected specific personalities. When the pious or childlike personality was in control, Louis Vivet was hopelessly paralyzed, unable to move a muscle from the waist down. However, the instant the violent or artisanal personality emerged, often after a seizure or a hypnotic trance, the paralysis disappeared. The man stood up, walked, ran, and displayed impressive physical strength. How was this possible? How could a physical condition, such a profound neurological failure, appear and disappear with a change of thought? This suggested that the paralysis was not in the nerves of his legs, but somewhere much deeper and more inaccessible, in the very structure of his identity. Hypnosis, therefore, became central to the entire case. For the doctors of Charcot's school, it was the ultimate tool. It was simultaneously an instrument of diagnosis and display. In sessions bordering on the theatrical, the doctors used hypnosis to dissect Vivet's mind. With a calm and authoritative voice, they called the personalities by the names they had been given. "Now, Jules, the violent one, I want to talk to you." And, like an actor obeying a cue, Vivet's body transformed. His posture changed, his facial expression hardened. The doctor then asked Jules about his memories, his fears, and tried to extract information about the original trauma, about the real Louis. They tried to use hypnosis to find the origin, to understand how the viper trauma had caused this fracture. But hypnosis, even then, was deeply controversial. There was a rival school of thought, notably the Nancy school, which argued that hypnosis did not revealed memories. She them created. They accused Charcot and his followers of inducing suggestion in their patients. Were the doctors, in their eagerness to discover a spectacular case, inadvertently creating these 10 personalities in Vivet? Was his hypnotic authority telling a suggestible and diseased mind to fragment itself? This question hung over the case, adding a sinister layer of mystery. Were the doctors objective observers, or were they themselves the architects of this broken mind? Regardless of the controversy, the case exploded. Louis Vivet ceased to be a patient and became a medical celebrity, a scientific monster. His case was simply too spectacular to be kept within the walls of the asylum. He was presented at medical conferences. Imagine the scene: a large amphitheater in Paris, full of doctors in tailcoats, smoking cigars, while on stage, under blinding lights, Louis Vivet is put into a trance. The leading physician demonstrates his discovery, summoning the different personalities to the audience, like a magician displaying his tricks. Look, now he's paralyzed. Now, with a word, he walks. Now he's a saint. Now he's a demon. Articles were written dissecting every aspect of his fragmentation. He became le cas Vivet, the definitive of double or triple or decuple hysteria. He was an object of study, a scientific curiosity show. Today, we would look at this with horror, seeing the exploitation and lack of ethics in turning a traumatized man into a spectacle. But, for the medicine of 1888, driven by relentless curiosity and a certain positivist arrogance, Vivet was a treasure. He was living proof of the hidden powers of the mind, and they would study him exhaustively, regardless of the human cost to Louis himself. Amidst all this scientific spectacle, there was one question that obsessed the most serious doctors. Where was the real Louis Vivet? They operated under the assumption that, Somewhere within that cacophony of voices, the young worker frightened by the viper still existed. The other personalities were believed to be parasites, unhealthy growths in his psyche. The goal, therefore, became integration, or more brutally, the suppression of the unwanted personalities to restore the original. Psyche. Attempts were thwarted and, frankly, cruel by modern standards. They tried to reason with the personalities. They tried to use hypnosis to force a merger, to kill the most problematic alter egos. But how to do it? Each personality fervently believed in its own existence. Each had its own memories and traumas. The violent personality saw the original Louis as weak and pathetic. The childlike personality was trapped in a terror from which it could not escape. Trying to integrate them was like trying to sew together 10 different pieces of cloth that didn't fit together. The complexity was overwhelming. Doctors realized they weren't dealing with a simple disease. They were dealing with a complex mental ecosystem where each part, however diseased it seemed, served a function. So, what happened to Louis Vivet? Here, the story, so meticulously documented at its peak, becomes frustratingly silent. Medical records cease. Asylum records become scarce. The ultimate fate of the man with 10 personalities is a mystery, which only adds to the grim nature of his story. Several possibilities exist. He may have escaped. One of his more capable and unparalyzed personalities may simply have seen an opportunity, walked out the asylum gates, and disappeared into the vast population of France. It's an intriguing image. A man holding back a crowd, lost in the streets of Paris. Another possibility, more likely and sadder, is that he was simply transferred. When the scientific novelty wore off, when doctors realized they couldn't cure or integrate him, he ceased to be a fascinating case and reverted to being a burden. He may have been sent to a long-term asylum, a place for the chronically and incurably ill, to live out the rest of his days in oblivion, perhaps stabilizing into one of his personalities, or perhaps continuing to shift, invisible to the world that once studied him so intensely. The lack of a clear cure was not a specific failure. It was a reflection of the total inability of the medicine of the time to deal with such profound psychological trauma. They could observe, they could catalog, but they could not cure. Despite his disappearance from historical records, Louis Vivet's impact was lasting and profound. He left an unintended legacy. The case, though misunderstood, and perhaps even misinterpreted by the physicians of 1888, was one of the first modern case studies of severe dissociation to be documented in such detail. The articles written about him, the meticulous notes on his different personalities, memories, and physical states have not disappeared. They were read by a new generation of psychologists and psychiatrists, such as Pierre Janet, who began to theorize about the disintegration of consciousness under trauma. The Vivet case was a stone thrown into a calm lake. Ripples spread far beyond 19th-century France. It forced medicine to confront a profoundly disturbing truth. Human identity, the self that we all presume to be, singular and stable, is, in fact, a fragile construct. The case of Louis Vivet laid the groundwork for the future understanding of dissociation, trauma, and what, a century later, would finally be called dissociative identity disorder. Louis Vivet, the man, may have been lost in the mists of time, but his bizarre and tragic story has become a ghostly pillar in the foundation of modern psychiatry. If you were moved by this story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you liked most. Your opinion is very important to us. Share this video with someone who needs an inspiring story. Until next time.